I want to talk about the Autopots and go over a few issues that I've come across, as well as some common ones that I've seen others come across, and give some tips along the way just to kind of help guide anybody new or anybody struggling with Autopots, and get them in the right direction, or anybody that's hesitant and maybe wanting to switch over but isn't too sure. I'm going to try to answer as much as I can, as well as using this video as just like some forum. Like if you got a problem or you got a solution, you come across something, drop that down in the comment section. Somebody's probably here, they're wanting to find that information. I'll include timestamps so you can pretty much find anything that this video covers. But without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about them. To start off, I want to talk about the way in which Autopots work. Right here you have a tray, right here you have a pot. You pop that into there, pop your plant in there. You have your tube, and then you have a reservoir which that will connect to, and then the reservoir is what keeps everything going, and what controls the water level is that valve. I'll touch on that later, but that's the process in which it works. Then all the water is collected down there in the tray and then wicked up through the bottom of the pots into the plant where it is capable of drinking. A few different things to note, things that the Autopot has in it. I recommend having this little air pocket right here, this little air space right here. It's like a little 1 inch that you put at the bottom of the pot, as well as this mesh right here. This stops the roots from going down there into the tray, causing problems for it to work properly. And then this right here just gives that little air gap right there to allow the plants some breathing rooms, kind of like in DWC where you got some space between the net pot and the roots in the water. And then with this airspace down here, you can also pull that out. Right here, you got this pocket right here, which then you could put a little air dome in, which is the air domes. And then from there, it'll kind of act like DWC. You got a tube running down there into that little gap right there and providing your bubbles and whatnot, getting a little aeration down there. And then of course, it's going to add more aeration, which is going to overall improve growth. But now I want to go over some tips and go over the issues with it. So starting off, we'll talk about our reservoir. I'll talk about mixing the water. With the water, the nutrients that you go with, for one, if you're going cocoa or something like that, if you go organic, you just use tap water, whatever water you use. You don't have to worry about all the other stuff. I know you guys don't pH. I know you guys don't add nutrients to the tank or whatever. You make your teas or stuff like that. So for those that use salts, when you make your water, make sure, for one, the nutrients you're using are water soluble. You don't want anything gunking up this system. It needs to be gunk free in order to operate and function properly. If not, you're definitely going to run into some issues with that valve. I'll touch on that later, like I said. So once you got your nutrients mixed, it's recommended that you pH between 5.5 and 5.6 as the process of it flowing into the trays and getting to the plants. During that process, it just increases the pH quite a bit, and that little airspace at the bottom of the cocoa between the root zone and the water, that space will be a good bit higher. So if you prep it at 5.8 throughout the process of filling up the trays and whatnot, going in the tubing, I don't really know the science behind it and all that shit, but just know this is what happens. The pH will creep up. So you start off at 5.5, it creeps up by 0.3 or 6.1, then that little space below the root zone, it's creeping up a bit higher, so maybe 6.3, 6.4 down there. Throughout the week it may shift and whatnot. So especially as the plants uptake nutrients and whatnot, that could really cause it to move around. So it's recommended to go 5.5, 5.6, and that's when you're feeding the Autopot way. That's what I say, the Autopot way, feeding through the bottom. But before we even get to that process, when I fill these up, I go at cocoa, and then I'll transplant my clone or my seedlings in here. And before I even get to feeding the Autopot way, I'm feeding from above. I got to get that root zone to develop and actually reach the bottom to where they would be able to even wick up those nutrients and survive. So the first week, maybe two, depending on if I'm starting from seed or whatever, I'll let that root zone develop, and then from there I'll stop top feeding. Which when I top feed, I'm feeding at 5.8. It's just the nutrients I always have prepped. It's the way the pH I always feed at whenever I'm going from above. And then whenever I start feeding the Autopot way, I'll go back to the 5.5, 5.6. Usually I'm at 5.6, and then the plants should be just fine. Also with the reservoir, the longevity of them, it all depends. So usually I'm rocking in 4. So if I got 4 plants on a 10 gallon, that can last me early on in veg 2 weeks. So there's been times where I've gone away a week and I was good to go. But as the plants develop, that root zone builds, they start to drink more. That shifts down to a week, and then flower, whenever they're going crazy, you could see like maybe 4 days where you need to refill that thing. So I always suggest going on the higher end when choosing a reservoir. I've got the 10s, the 25s, the big old 100 right here. This 100 isn't hooked up to any Autopots. It's actually basically just a reservoir for a pump, which runs to this tent behind me. But for the Autopots, I'm usually using the 25 gallons, and that's what I would recommend starting off if you're gonna go 4 plants or more. That'll give you lead time to be away from the plants at least and just let them do them. The EC that I'm feeding my plants is 1.2 in veg, and then I'll go up about 1.6 to 1.6 to 2 in flower as we transition from the early on to late. You don't really have to go too heavy in this. Other systems I'm at 2 to 3 EC and whatnot. So a little bit lower on the EC and whatnot, the nutrients, the dosages, whatever that is in ppm. I want to say like 700, I don't know off the top of my head, do the calculations off what I said, and then just try whatever that works for you. All right, now once you got your system all hooked up, the way that you should configure it, there's a bunch of videos how you should configure it. I wouldn't suggest doing it the way I'm doing. I would suggest adding another line so you can easily drain these pots, or just use like a shop vacuum and suck them up. Whenever it's time to like empty out trays and stuff like that. I like to empty them in between water changes just because it completely resets what's in there. Everything that I've prepped is now going into there. And then I'm also doing that during lights off. Usually I don't really fuck around and change any water or anything like that during the day because I want them to focus on growing rather than trying to figure out like, I don't like the way this shit tastes. Every time you refill this tank, one thing that I suggest is wait a little bit in between that. Make sure whenever you fill the tray up, make sure this little valve here at the bottom, make sure it hits the level, it shuts off the water flow and things don't overflow inside of the tray, or just make sure it's filling up in general, because like I said, things can gunk up in here with this valve and cause it not to work, or the little 2 blue things could be missing. Once you get your system, always make sure those 2 blue things are there. If they're missing, make sure you get some more of them. At any point, if you ever lose them, you need those to operate it. But there's a blue thing here on the top valve, which will sit up there, and then there's another blue one on the inside down there, and those will help seal the water and whatnot. And then always make sure in between water changes, make sure you watch it fill back up. It takes like all of like 30 seconds to a minute, and then all right, everything's full, we're good to go. The plants are going to uptake it, it's going to empty, and it's going to refill back up. If for whatever reason it ever overflows or it's not flowing properly, always shut off the system. Make sure you check it, make sure those blue things are there. If they're not there, reset them. Lift up this thing, make sure there's not anything blocking the actual tubing and whatnot. I'll talk about how to help flush that out. That's why I recommend flushing your system and adding that additional little knob at the end to allow water out when you drain it. And then if you do come across something to where it gunks it up, just completely empty it out, and then check on all those points and then refill it back up, and then from that point you should be good to go. And to talk about things building up and whatnot, right here we got some Run Clean by Crop Salt. This is going to help eliminate any of that buildup down there in the reservoir. If you've been growing them for a little bit using salts, you'll see the salts and whatnot, that the little scale buildup around the edges of the trays, down here into the tubing and whatnot. Really not a factor. Clean in between runs, you're good to go, but it could get bad to a point it just gunks up everything. And then as well as other things like plant material, cocoa and stuff that falls in there. But for that scale that builds up all the salt, something like Run Clean is really going to help. You can use it as a pH down. Shit's very potent. I'm not going to lie, you add a couple drops of this, or if you used to be having a heavy hand, they lighten it up with this motherfucker, boy, that shit'll drop your pH fast as hell. So you use this, very fucking potent. You don't have to use a whole lot of it. It's 0.2 to 0.4 milliliters per gallon to prevent buildup and scale. And that'll help prevent that, as well as break it down if it's already in there, and you just flush out your system. With the system flushing it out, I would recommend at some point in veg, some point in flower, maybe in that transition phase, you just shut off the valve, open up your drain, flush out the entire system, water from above, just to kind of help wash and flush anything that may have built down there in that wicking process. That'll really help you from running into issues like lockout and whatnot, and you really won't have too much to worry about. Then I would only suggest doing like 2-3 times throughout the entire grow process. There's also been times where I didn't do it at all, but I've always found the best success when I do it about halfway in veg, going into flower, and then in like the middle flower, everything seems to be pretty do pretty well with that, and those usually are the times where I change up my nutrient dosages anyway, so it's good to reset that. Now I want to talk about light. For the most part, when growing in Autopots, what I've noticed is that I typically rock my lights, the intensity of them, I dim them down a little bit more than I typically would. I'm assuming that's maybe just the lower EC or whatnot, but with Autopots I don't have to rock my lights as high. It still puts out crazy fucking yields and whatnot like that. It's just they can't handle the light for whatever reason. I don't really care about the reason why. I just know from personal experience, they just don't do well for me, at least early on, like veg. But once you hit flower, they're good to go. You can pump them motherfuckers with 1,000 ppfd and whatnot. But early on in veg, you know, I'm rocking below like 300 to keep the clones happy or whatnot. Seeds a little bit more hardy. They don't really have those same light requirements. Clones in general are just gonna have a low tolerance for the intensity of lights initially. When it comes to pest with Autopots, I think Autopots are the best for using fucking pests. For one, I got into cocoa hearing that, like, hey, cocoa, you know, it's inert, you know, not really going to be any pests or anything like that. They can't survive in that shit. That's what I heard initially. I'm gonna be honest, bro. Cocoa ain't no different than fucking soil. Maybe in soil they go a little bit more crazy, but cocoa, that's a fucking hunch like a motherfucker, and they be just fine in cocoa, as well as any other pest, man. Cocoa do not deter them motherfuckers from shit. So, but with the Autopots, I really like, you know, having to treat, you know, I don't like having to, but it's I like how easy it is to treat for pests and stuff like that. A few different things that I will use for pests. When it comes to spray, I'm using the Athena IPM, the Dr. Zyme. I got some Dr. Zymes right here. I'll use that. Use this with some like lukewarm water. What else I use? Micronized sulfur, that is probably the one and done. That if you had to get anything that I'm about to name, that is probably like the one, and that's the cure for every pest you're probably gonna run into, and that shit works. Like, I'm talking about like fast results, like it fucks them up, baby. And then other than the micronized sulfur, which for the micronized sulfur I'm using that at 2 tablespoons per gallon. Could be completely off, it could be 4. Sometimes, you know, I get a heavy hand, I don't really remember the ratios in which I use it. Pretty sure it's 2. And then another product right here, some diatomaceous from the mountains of Mauritius earth right here. This is just like a little powder. It really looks like a fucking powder, I don't know, like the little powdered sugar or whatever. You just add that like the shit on a funnel cake. That's what it looks like. You just add that to the top due to the fact that the plants are being bottom fed, because you know diatomaceous earth, it's powdery at first, but once you water it, that shit all clumps up like a little clay and whatnot. But once you got them hooked up to Autopot where they're feeding from the bottom, the top's going to be dry. That's going to make it hard for gnats and shit like that to thrive at the top. But sometimes, you know, maybe like I said, you're flushing from the top, or you know the water really wicks up there or whatnot. They can, you know, they can dig into the sides of the motherfuckers and get down to the point where it's wet. You know, motherfuckers love to survive. So something like that, diatomaceous, you know what the hell I'm trying to say, putting that on the top, that'll really help combat pests since it's dry up there. That's anything I could think on for tips and issues with Autopots. If you guys have any, you know, questions or anything like that, or answers to any problems that you've come across, drop them down below in the comment section. If for whatever reason you want to be a sicko like myself and get yourself an Autopot and switch over to the dark side and actually enjoy growing and make it super fucking fun and easy, and you want to switch over to these Autopots, use code Dusa Farms at checkout. Other than that, I appreciate you guys for watching the video. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, stick around, turn on the post notification bells. You know what I'm trying to say. Appreciate you. Until next time.